Oh boy. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. Now, first and foremost, I would like to reserve my privilege to refer to Mr. Mike Buchanan as the Right Honorable Party President. And I don't care who's offended by that. To me, he is the Right Honorable Party President, and this man has been working so hard to make this happen. So please, give him more applause. Please. Now, when the Right Honorable Party President, Mr. Buchanan, asked me to provide a title for this speech, I provided the title, The Status of Men in Continental Europe, Ideology, Legislation, and Activism, with a view to come up, with up-to-date statistics and comparisons and numbers and nice PowerPoint graphs that would show various areas in which men fare not just worse than women, but also a lot worse than they used to 20 or 30 years ago. And that trend is almost continuous in almost every nation of this old continent. But that was in January, long before I would finally learn that numbers don't exactly matter, and most certainly never matter when it comes to public discourse. Just last week, there was a protest in this city, in London, with whining feminism and others like them, complaining that the Brexit vote would mean the end of a South African chain store and the end of their capacity to visit Norway. These are the supposed informed voters, as opposed to, the pro-Brexit maniacs who dare to disagree with having their cucumbers regulated by foreigners. So under these conditions, I will not bore you with numbers and just say this. The notion of male privilege anywhere in Europe is simply bonkers and incongruent with reality. Never in history has it been the case for the supposed privileged to live fewer years than the supposed oppressed. Never in history has it been the case for the supposed privileged to be purposely excluded from various institutions to the benefit of the supposed oppressed, or to be driven to suicide 3 to 6 times more than the supposed oppressed. In Lithuania, for instance, the suicide rate of men is 61.3 per 100,000, compared to 10 per 100,000 when it comes to women. In Russia, it's 53.9 compared to 9.5. In Ukraine, it's 37.7 compared to 7. In Ireland, it's 19 compared to 4.7. But anyway, I said I won't be bothering you with numbers, so let's evaluate the three axes that are of interest for this talk: ideology, legislation, and activism. Now, it is my contention that unless the underlying ideology is defeated, the relentless legislative assault on men will simply not stop. I draw this statement from the lessons of history. For instance, when the so-called international community pressed the Soviet Union to end the practice of imprisoning dissenters or dissidents, the Soviet Union eventually did abolish the Gulag administration. But that did not actually end the practice, didn't it? The dissidents were then swiftly sent into psychiatric institutions or psychiatric hospitals and continued to be persecuted in various ways right until the very last day of existence of the Soviet Union. Now, why is that? Well, it's because the underlying ideology of the system that had set up all this thing had yet to be defeated. When German men's rights activists challenged the German state and won at the European Court of Human Rights, forcing the Bundestag to extend the rights of fathers, did that significantly change the game? Of course it didn't. And the reason is exactly the same. The underlying ideology had not yet been defeated. Now, when I say ideology, one may be forgiven for thinking that I'm referring to feminism in particular. But I refer to more than just feminism. In fact, in a way, the term worldview would be far more appropriate than the term ideology. It is the worldview that women are oppressed when they clearly aren't. It is the worldview that women are the main victims of violence when in reality most violence is inflicted upon men. It is the worldview that mothers matter more than fathers, and that fathers' human and parental rights are, in a best-case scenario, to be considered only when they don't make the mother feel uncomfortable, or simply not to be considered at all, in the most common scenario. It is the worldview that regards anything to be more important than the humanity of men and boys. Stray dogs, for instance, have more rights to bodily autonomy in Europe than infant boys. Same goes for the feelings of the believers in backwards mythologies, which are routinely deemed to be far more important than the health and integrity of infant boys. And the examples go on and on and on. Now, you will hear tomorrow from technically my boss, Mr. Paul Elam, about gynocentrism, so I don't want to step on his toes, but I'll say this. Gynocentrism can at least be severely curbed, and that is certain. And I know that because, after all, Europe still had largely gynocentric societies 20 or 30 years ago. But it was unheard of in 1990, for instance, of teenage boys being sent to concentration camps or re-education camps for non-feminist thought. Nowadays, well, it is a legitimate consideration for the European Union through a document called the European Framework Statute for the Promotion of Tolerance, which defines anti-feminism as a hate crime, and that Section 7b reads that, quote, juveniles convicted of committing crimes, such as expressing anti-feminist positions, will, quote, be required to undergo a rehabilitation program designed to instill in them a culture of tolerance. I think we can all agree that there is a substantive difference between a gynocentric society of, I don't know, let's say 1990 France, and a gynocentric society like that of today, where it's not even newsworthy that a supranational body wants to imprison children who offend the ideological sensibility of a tiny minority. Because let's not forget that less than 10% of women on this continent identify as feminists, and an even smaller proportion of men do so. Understanding the ideological underpinnings of the current state of affairs is crucial to winning the battle on the long run, because ideology is the root of most of the insanity men have to deal with today. Now, I'll come back on this point in a few minutes when I get to activism. But until then, let's discuss legislation. Now, for the British folks in the audience, this portion may not be of such a big significance if the British government follows through the electoral demand and invoke the Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. Nevertheless, if that doesn't happen, or if the negotiations go rather towards a Norwegian model instead of a Swiss model, this portion will still be of interest. Basically, there are three pieces of legislation that are threatening the liberty of all men in Europe, with the possible exception of those living in Belarus or Switzerland. Now, one is, of course, the Istanbul Convention. Now, it is disheartening to me that the sole source documenting the evils of this document is still, even today, my article on the subject published on A Voice for Men 3.5 years ago in January 2013. If one Googles for the Istanbul Convention, the first 6 results are Wikipedia to European Union Communicates, and the actual text of the document. And the 7th is my article on why this is dangerous. Now, I'm not saying that with any sort of pride. On the contrary, I'm deeply worried that the most important dissenting voice comes from a neck-bearded guy with a YouTube channel. The Istanbul Convention, or by its longer and complete name, Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, is basically the ultimate feminist manifesto. Think about it as a Violence Against Women Act for Europe. I mean, Paul said yesterday that VAWA shuffles around $600 million per year in funding. Well, the Istanbul Convention starts its bidding for feminist funding at around 2.1 billion euros in the European Union alone. And it's a Council of Europe document, so it includes Russia, it includes Ukraine, it includes Norway, it includes non-EU countries as well. So we were looking at least 3 billion euros annually in wages for feminist ideologues. Under the Istanbul Convention, anything that happens to any woman anywhere is ipso facto men's fault. For instance, the preamble of the document says that any violence against women is gender-based because it is. Of course, any violence against men is not gender-based. And Article 2.2 explicitly mentions that female victims of domestic violence are to be given special consideration, whereas male victims of exactly the same crime can be ignored, since the governments are not mandated to protect them, but just encouraged to do so. Article 12.4 of the Istanbul Convention mandates the ratifying countries to, quote, take the necessary measures to encourage all members of society, especially men and boys, to contribute actively to preventing all forms of violence covered by the scope of this convention, unquote. And that's just the beginning. Now, in the interest of saving time for the Q&A, I would advise you all to read my long article about this document, because the document itself is so full of such gems that we could spend several hours talking about it. So far, on this continent, only Hungary and Czechia, or formerly the Czech Republic, clearly and unapologetically refused to ratify the document and threw it into the dustbin of history. Everywhere else is still fair game. Now, the second piece of legislation that's coming is the one that I mentioned earlier as well, the European Framework Statute for the Promotion of Tolerance. Now, I love this document for one simple reason, because it follows the Orwellian pattern of the European Union, since the Framework for the Promotion of Tolerance is by far one of the most intolerant policy proposals in the recent history of the European Union. This document aims to amend the criminal codes of every EU country to include things like group libel, and in Section 1 of the document explains that holding to ridicule is considered group libel, and then Section 2E of the document explicitly says that, quote, the purpose of this statute is to take concrete action to combat intolerance, in particular with a view to eliminating racism, color bias, ethnic discrimination, religious intolerance, totalitarian ideologies, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-feminism, and homophobia. Now, this document, just like the Istanbul Convention, is not exactly a new thing, but the way the EU bureaucracy tends to work is that it takes several years until it comes into force, and it slowly creeps into the European society's way of life, and your average citizen will notice it only when it's far too late. Because as experience shows us, once something becomes a European directive, there's no way back. But don't forget that opposing the EU is extremism. It says so on the BBC, so it must be true. Now, the third piece of legislation that's coming is not exactly a law, since it cannot be opposed through the political process, or at least not efficiently. Now, this is a World Health Organization document called the Standards for Sexuality Education in Europe, dubbed as a framework for policymakers, educational and health authorities, and specialists. In other words, this is already being slowly implemented school by school, and it doesn't actually need the approval of any political body, other than some small-time bureaucrats in the ministries of education, and sometimes not even that. And the recourse for parents and students is also wildly limited, with the notable exception of Switzerland again, where there was an actual referendum in a canton about school policies inspired by this document, and the citizens won. But that was the exception. The rule is to have this steamrolled into classrooms whether you like it or not. And since Europe doesn't have a tradition in homeschooling or genuinely private sector-oriented schools, this one is going to be harder to fight against and requires individual activism within small communities. Basically, for the interests of this audience, this framework advises teachers to teach the next generation about masturbation at the age of 3, about exploring gender identity at the age of 2, and no, I'm not joking, nor am I exaggerating, just see the page 41 of this document, and then it goes progressively, like a disease, as the children grow in age. For instance, for the age group 6 to 9, classes about sexual violence and aggression are included. Can you guess who writes the curricula for these? Because sure, it isn't the patriarchy, nor is it the church or normal people in general, that's for sure. Also, for the age group 6 to 9, there is a class in the toolbox about the sexual rights of children. And from the age group 15 and up, the whole progressive claptrap is brought into the classroom. Now, this may not sound really that bad until one looks at the schools where this has already been tried. And there are quite a few examples, such as the Trieste school in Italy, where following this framework, the teachers developed Il Gioco del Rispetto, or the respect game, which involved sessions of 4-year-old children being encouraged to explore each other's genitals. But that was only after they were asked to get dressed as the opposite sex and question every child for their insistence of wishing to pursue a profession that is stereotypical of their sex. In France, the program ABCD for Equality was eventually shut down, but only after a few years of protests from parents. That particular program included lessons for 8-year-olds about political lesbianism, prostitution, and the benefits of anal sex. In Norway, a children's carnival was cancelled because it wasn't egalitarian enough, since those pesky indoctrinated boys dared to dress as superheroes and those poor little oppressed girls dared to dress as princesses. You see, that's not the progressive way. It is also interesting to note that the feminists, on one hand, claim to decry the sexualization of children, but on the other hand, the Department of Women's and Children's Health of the University of Uppsala in Sweden, which is basically the main center of radical ideology in Europe since its inception, this particular department is a top contributor of this document. On the other hand, not one of the signatories is someone known to be rejecting the misandric totalitarian ideology of feminism. Not even one. Again, I do suggest you read the actual document and make up your own mind about it, because the document is 68 pages long, so in the interest of saving time, again, I'll avoid going deeper into this document. Alright, so let's get to the third and the most important part of this talk, activism. Now, I will take the liberty to assume that in this conference we all do understand activism to mean a lot more than marches in the streets or signing petitions, so I won't go into that. What I will dwell a bit on is the style of activism, an aspect that's hardly been comprehensively analyzed. The non-feminist position is, for all intents and purposes, the anti-establishment Aryan position at this point, since virtually all political parties of every country in Europe are indeed infected with the feminist ideology. Now, admittedly, the degree of infection varies, and some political parties may actually reject feminism on a declarative level, but still practice the same all-toxic worldview. I mean, sure, you can label that as classical gynocentrism, but as far as I'm concerned, from an activist standpoint, the differences are minuscule. Now, once one understands these things, it becomes far more clear why, for instance, the feminists are so reluctant to talk about touchy subjects like the Rotherham scandal, the Cologne scandal, or any other situation of actual harm done to women and girls by members of the religion of special needs. We all laughed at... Now, we all laughed at Sargon's video with the big red and an Islamist, but there's far more truth in that statement called "Feminists Love Islamists" than it would seem at a first glance. For instance, if you think divorce proceedings in Europe are a bad deal for men, check out the divorce proceedings in Iran, and specifically the Sharia law notions of mehriye and nafaka. Now, the reason I'm mentioning these aspects is to emphasize how much of a mountain there is in front of any non-feminist trying to come up with ways of activism. Now, the good news is that these days are probably the best days since 1990 for anti-establishment Aryans. As opposed to 10 or 11 years ago when I started exploring non-feminist thought, the general culture is a lot more prepared today for non-feminist positions. Many of you sure do remember how rare it was for a mainstream outlet to speak out about male victims of domestic violence or about how the wage gap narrative is rubbish, so a significant amount of progress has indeed been achieved on that front. Another aspect that needs to be known is the fact that the general public is a lot less trustworthy of the mainstream press than it was 5 or 10 years ago. But it goes even deeper than that. A recent YouGov poll revealed that roughly 65% of the general British public tends to give a lot more credence to ordinary people than to experts, political figures, or media figures. Similar trends can be observed in most countries of Europe. 3 more examples. In France, the public thinks that 6 out of 10 journalists lie most of the time due to either political or financial pressures, and with a sizable majority of the public considering that the mainstream press simply doesn't cover the issues that the public wants to know about. In my own country, Romania, only 34.5% of the populace trusts the press, to be honest, way below the church or the army. In Norway, a bit over 1 in 3 Norwegians, 35% to be more accurate, thinks that the mainstream press gives an accurate view of reality. Now, what do all of these mean? Well, it means that it's a fabulous moment to be an advocate of positions that are not kosher with the establishment. While we, as non-feminists, do indeed have a huge mountain of lies to demolish in front of us, we also have to demolish them with a public that is willing, generally, to listen. Now, nothing of what I said so far is really that radical, but the method of activism that I want to propose is a little bit radical in the sense that it has rarely been tried by non-feminist groups. And for good reason. The climate is horrifying in some corners of the European societies. But nevertheless, it should indeed be tried. So basically, I'm putting forward the modest proposal of Enlightened Agitprop. Now, the term agitprop does bring bad memories because the term does originate from the Soviet Union. However, I contend that Agitprop is merely a tool, just like knives or laptops. Now, what this means in practice is to get on the ground and disseminate knowledge peer-to-peer. Now, as I said earlier, this is the best moment in time for non-feminists and other anti-establishmentarian groups, indeed, to get on the ground and win hearts and minds, because the trust of the public in regular people compared to the so-called experts is at a record high, and this should indeed be used to a much larger extent than it is used today. The only group that I know that does this is a group of youngsters acting in 4 or 5 countries of Europe, which every year goes to several universities and convinces students to change their degree from gender studies to something else. It works. That's what I can tell you about them. They've managed to shut down several gender studies centers. But that's a very complex form of agitprop developed in several years. There are also simpler forms, such as starting with yourself. For instance, many non-feminists don't talk at all about their views outside of the internet, and that has to change, and fast. It was amazing to me, at least at first, how easy it can be to not just plant seeds of doubt, but to completely deprogram a person from gynocentric thinking in just a few days of meeting at a coffee or during a cigarette break at the workplace. The key is simply to not sound like an activist. So, for instance, when you're asked about domestic violence, you don't get on to recite Dr. Maurice Strauss's work with full citations, but rather respond like, a normal person. Also, as many of you are probably aware, the non-feminist thought can easily be adapted to appeal to the sensibilities of almost every position on the political spectrum, except for the far left. That's why I encourage my non-feminist friends to join NGOs, work groups, workshops, clubs, churches, whatever social institution they can, and slowly influence it from within via peer-to-peer persuasion. In other words, agitprop. Now, I do realize that this may not sound like a good idea to some individuals, but it is nonetheless a method that works and has already yielded fantastic results, not just with men's issues, but with other causes as well. Now, at this point, we, as non-feminists, are amongst the few schools of alternative thought that does not do this at a high extent. The feminists indeed do have paid infiltrators and shields to deal with us. And if you think I sound conspiratorial by saying this, please think about how David Fertel makes his living, and I'll gladly reconsider my position. I'll also gladly provide further examples of shields and infiltrators in private after this, if you really want that. Basically, what I am advocating is Agent Orange in real life and with a wider agenda. Agent Orange infiltrated the Radfem hub with the purpose of screen capping as much insanity as possible and then expose it to the world. What I am advocating is infiltrating any social, political, or economic institution with a view of doing anything humanly possible to change its direction towards a non-feminist way. And this can mean anything from exposing its internal work to gradually moving its focus away from misandric practices. For instance, a friend of mine became an HR officer in a big corporation. It took her 5 months to persuade everyone that the female-favoring affirmative action policy is wrong and indeed needs to be abolished. But she did it. Now, the only downside of this approach is that it's largely thankless. You lose if you brag about it, at least for now. But the upside is that individuals without any coordination of any kind, individuals without any coordination of any kind can indeed by themselves effect immediate change within their communities. If every non-feminist in Europe would engage in such practices, the harm done by feminist-inspired policy would be severely diminished and, in some countries of Europe, even completely abolished. This can be done, and the more unknown you are in this non-feminist conglomerate, the more likely you are, indeed, to succeed. And with that, I'll stop here and invite you to ask questions.
I had a quick question regarding what was it, Iranian or Iraqi practice of mariage. I missed the significance of that in the overall.
Okay. Mehriye is basically a lump sum that the husband commits to paying to the wife in case anything goes wrong. So, for instance, if you want to divorce your wife, you have to pay the mehriye. Nafaka is the daily payment that the husband is obligated by law to pay to his wife. Now, women in Islam can also make an income, but all their income is theirs and theirs alone. Men's income, however, is taxed by two people, the husband, the wife, and the state. So, and the mehriye, you know, they now vary between $300,000 US dollars and $500,000 US dollars. Now, considering that the average wage of a working man in the Islamic world is around $200 a month, you can imagine how expensive a divorce can get in Islam.
Hi there. You mentioned this tolerance group. I wrote to them an email asking what democratic participation in this process may look like. I didn't get an answer.
Shock.
I'm shocked to hear that, indeed.
I was shocked too. But to me, this was more like a private organization trying to lobby several European governments. And I lost track of what they were doing. So do you have an update like what happened in the last 2 or 3 years?
You are indeed correct that the most of the European Statute for the Promotion of Tolerance was indeed written by a private NGO. The thing is that the EU bureaucrats were supposed to amend it and then steamrolled it into law for everyone else, for all of us to just swallow it. Something happened along the way, which can be summed up as several MEPs found out that they still have a conscience and basically blocked it somewhere within the committees. So as a result, for now, it's not happening. But that was during the José Manuel Durão Barroso Commission. Given that the new commission, the Juncker Commission, is, at least, Durão Barroso was a committed Maoist, but was not necessarily a progressive feminist. Juncker is a committed feminist. I would be surprised if during this Juncker Commission he wouldn't try again to steamroll, to put it again through the committees, and the new European Parliament to approve it. I hope it doesn't happen. But yes, indeed, its origins are from a private NGO, but that doesn't mean that they can't make us all follow it. Does this answer your question? Okay.
Hi. You spoke about the special situation regarding Czechia and Hungary within legislative framework of the EU. And as well, we see in the blogosphere a kind of resurgence of looking towards Eastern Europe as opposed to Western Europe as a place where the MRA and the HRA may find some kind of refuge, as well as defections from Sweden and from Finland to St. Petersburg because of its proximity and because of its more amenable social climate. Can you talk a little bit about why, if you see that happening, and if you do see it happening, what may be the cause of it?
The cause of it is, of course, having spent 50 years under communism, you tend to know where this radical egalitarianism actually leads to. So, when you see your mother dragged from the house and taken forcibly to the work because women are equal to men and they can do everything men do, so therefore women, whether they want it or not, have had to work every job that men do. When you see these kinds of things, you understand what the logical conclusion of progressive feminism really is. You understand what the logical conclusion of collectivism is. So, of course, after 50 years of that, well, let's just say that in Eastern Europe we enjoy having a breath of fresh air, at least for now, until the progressive degenerative eventually invade us too. Which is one of the reasons why I would like to have the fight here as opposed to the streets of my city.
Yeah, I'm back here. Just have a comment. I'm concerned about how feminists conflate racism and sexism, and to underscore that, there's a saying I read that when men get together, we spend the evening insulting each other and don't mean a word of it. But when women get together, they spend the evening complimenting each other and don't mean a word of it.
Which is absolutely true.
I recall when I was young, I grew up in the Bronx, in the intersection between Italian, Jewish, Puerto Rican, and black neighborhoods. And God, did we insult each other constantly. But at the end of the day, there were only two teams on that stickball game, and we laid all those things aside. And I think men do have a tendency to verbalize a kind of nascent racism, but it never emerges any further than that. If you look at the U.S., it's women who are suing to stop affirmative action, not men. I think that I am concerned when I read Jezebel, whenever there's some sort of a racist attack, they will constantly twist racism and sexism together. And I think at some level, despite the fact that there are some men, for example, the shootings in the U.S. in Louisiana and Minneapolis, the vast majority of men will only speak racist comments, but they will never mean it and never act on it, whereas I'm not so sure that the damsels in distress do the same thing. I'm more concerned about them than I am about the men.
Yeah, I guess this conflation comes from the cultural Marxist origins of feminism, and there's this trifecta of race, sex, and class. So of course they're going to conflate them with, as much as they can, except when it's inconvenient. For instance, they're very keen on talking about race, sex, and class, until you remind them that white working class boys are the most hated upon group in this country, for instance, in Britain. Then they suddenly don't want to talk about class. So, so there's that. I think that's where the origin comes from. That's why they always conflate with each other. And when it comes to the fools that write for the Jezebel, I don't think it's clear even in their head why they're thinking the way they think.
Go ahead.
So with the European Framework Statute for the Promotion of Tolerance, they say that they want to take concrete action to combat intolerance and anti-feminism and things. Mm-hmm. What exactly are they doing? What do they plan to do?
Well, according to the document, it starts early on in the education, and it includes, it includes everything from mere fines to actual imprisonment and everything you can think about in between. For instance, I think it's Article 14, I think, Section 14 of the document, but or it could be 13. But anyway, lower in the lower half of the document, you will find that juveniles convicted of anti-feminist thought can be sent to a re-education program to instill in them a culture of tolerance. I quoted that in my speech. That's an actual policy being thought about. Now, I hope it doesn't happen. I hope it stays stuck in the bureaucracy of the EU until the EU collapses. But nevertheless, that's the presumption, the idea that they're starting from.
Okay.
Lucian, thank you so much for your reception and your insight. It's really refreshing to hear it. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Just picking up on the last point, I'm just intrigued that one is using coercion to promote tolerance is hardly tolerant, but that's another issue. You used the term several times, progressive feminism. Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, the First Minister of Scotland, cannot let a sentence go without mentioning the word progressive. Would you like to just share your view about what progressive really is, because it's a very amorphous but rapidly expanding concept?
Well, which is why it's useful for ideological agitprop. Well, the word progressive, like all other progressive words, including the word progressive, it means the opposite of what it says. Progressivism is more or less very close to a mental disorder. So that's it. I mean, that's how I view progressivism. Now, if you want me to go into detail, I guess it starts from a very. I think Janet put it best. If you haven't been through actual hardship your entire life, you actually think you're being oppressed because you're missing 50 pence, and you can't buy a coffee right now, and you have to wait for an hour to buy a coffee. That's oppression in the progressive mind, and that comes exactly from the fact that most progressives have never known actual hardship. I mean, how many progressives know how it is to stay for 8 or 9 hours in line to buy half a kilo of milk. I have no idea about that. Oh, and outside in minus 30 degrees. I don't think any progressive has any idea of that. That's why there are very few progressives in Eastern Europe.
You mentioned rehabilitation programs, and I want to doubt that they're going to strap young boys down and make them watch horror films and put drips in their eyes, but what are the mechanics of these rehabilitation programs, if you know?
Nobody knows at the moment, because like any law, it's first the law and then the norms of applying it. And since it hasn't become a law yet, there are no norms of applying it. But if I were to assume, of course, I wouldn't assume that they would just strap, pick boys randomly from the streets and things like that. I would assume they wouldn't go that far, though I could be wrong. I was wrong in the past, being overly optimistic about the EU. But I would assume that they would basically, threaten pupils with expulsion and things like that if they don't attend some bollocks classes where they're supposedly being educated to be more tolerant, which basically means to be as intolerant as possible. Because, to a progressive, that's why I always used to say progressive instead of liberals. Liberals tend to live and let live. Liberals understand that there is such thing as another point of view. To progressives, there is no other point of view.
Hello. Hi. Do you not think that, in a way, forcing young boys into indoctrination or re-education camps could in some way inspire some sort of backlash from them? Because as a number of speakers have mentioned, if you tell young boys not to do something, they immediately go and do it as much as they possibly can.
Of course, it is human nature. The more you poke the bear will eventually respond. Yes, it may indeed trigger a backlash. I mean, think about it this way. In Eastern Europe, the anti-communist revolutions were not organized by old people who knew how lives used to be before communism. It was organized exactly by the youngsters who had known nothing but communism in their entire lives and have been educated with nothing but communism in their entire education. So yes, it may indeed trigger such a backlash. Now, I would rather not get to that situation at all and just prevent this monstrosity to ever being enacted in the first place.
Hello, yes. Okay, so with the sort of radical feminist socialization within the education system, is there, sort of, I guess that would cause a lot of, contention with private schools, because obviously, the boys who go there, the parents are paying to get the best marks for them. So, are you seeing a divide there between private education and state education, which is, just goes with the party line?
There should be a divide, but I don't think it will happen, because you have to remember that the United Kingdom is used to be, because now we're hoping that the UK will no longer be in the European Union, but let's presume UK stays in the EU eventually, not by popular will, but by political class will. Only in the United Kingdom do private schools do indeed have almost entire autonomy. It is not the case in continental Europe. In continental Europe, the state dictates up to 70% of the curricula. So basically, the competitive advantage of the private schools is only limited to that 30% of the curricula. They compete only on that because, and of course, that kills the private sector long run, because they basically, if all schools are the same and one is free and one isn't, it's an unfair competition. But nevertheless, that's what I think the framers of this document also had in mind. They were like, well, if we can force private schools to, teach history in the way the state wants it to be taught, why can't we force the private schools to also teach feminism? Think about Germany, for instance. Germany is routinely lauded for having a very strong private education system compared to most of continental Europe, which is indeed true. But their history classes are still being dictated by the state. So why it would be very easy from a policy standpoint to extend that to classes in compulsory feminism or things like that.
Hi there. You said that kind of people in Eastern Europe are more or less more resistant to the whole feminist narrative. But
not by much, but yes, though.
Yeah. What I noticed about after 1990, my home country of Bulgaria, is that slowly but surely universities at least began to be more westernized. What's the situation in Romania like? Have you noticed something similar?
Yeah, my home city no longer has a gender studies department because of me, but yeah, I think I might be wrong on that because there's a private university and I haven't checked on that one whether they have one. But anyway, no, in all seriousness, yes, of course universities are being infiltrated, and of course they're being infiltrated using our tax money or our tax levy or whatever. And the reason this is happening is because of the EU. I mean, if you look at gender studies departments in state universities, not just in Romania, but anywhere else, basically in Prague or in Warsaw, you will see that most of them are funded not necessarily through the Ministry of Education, but usually there is the operational social program, the development of human resources, which is basically a EU code speak for cultural Marxist agitprop. So, you know, of course they're being infiltrated. Now, whether that indoctrination works or not is debatable. I would contend that it doesn't really work because, you know, I've been following several individuals who've been through gender studies in Bucharest, at the University of Bucharest, of the National School of Public Administration. That's where they have their HQ. And, you know, they became feminists by the end of their degree, but then they deprogrammed themselves 6 months after leaving the university. Because when the entire society is non-feminist, you are compelled to wake up to reality. And if you don't, well, there are only two solutions: to emigrate or to retreat forever into your safe space.
Ladies and gentlemen, Lucian Valsan.